Before any of these iconic sci-fi films reached theaters, before the premieres, the critics, and the decades of fan theories, they existed in a raw, unfiltered state that almost no one outside the industry ever saw. Long before studio executives trimmed scenes, softened tone, or restructured entire narratives, the original scripts carried ideas that were far bolder, far stranger, and in some cases, far more disturbing than anything that made it to the final cut. These early drafts weren't crafted to be marketable. They weren't polished for family audiences or adjusted for test screening. They were pure transmissions of creative intent, stories that pushed deep into speculative territory the studios ultimately weren't willing to touch. Some of these initial screenplays were dismissed for being too close to classified technology. Others contained themes deemed psychologically risky, leaning into existential dread or scientific speculation that echoed real-world research programs. A few drafts hinted at events or concepts that advisors quietly recommended removing entirely, and then there were the cases where performers claimed the story they filmed was not the story they first agreed to because somewhere along the way, the script they read had been reshaped into something more conventional, safer, easier to explain. These hidden drafts, buried in studio archives, mislabeled in storage rooms, or locked behind non-disclosure agreements, represent alternate histories of films we think we know. They reveal what the creators originally imagined, before budgets, legal pressure, or executive fears created the sanitized versions the world ultimately received. Tonight, we reopen those forgotten pages. We step into the versions of these 15 sci-fi films that existed before the edits, before the rewrites, before the approved versions replaced the daring originals. These aren't remakes or extended cuts. These are the stories as they were first conceived. 1. Interstellar. While the released version of Interstellar leans heavily on emotional resonance and scientific optimism, the earliest drafts imagined a universe that was far colder and far less forgiving. The wormhole near Saturn wasn't a beacon of hope, it was a byproduct of a cosmic disturbance that had destabilized gravitational fields throughout the solar system. Scientists believed it was a sign not of salvation, but of encroaching collapse. Cooper's character was originally conceived as someone profoundly altered by exposure to gravitational anomalies encountered during atmospheric test flights. His fragmented memories and recurring visions weren't sentimental, they were echoes from alternate timelines, fractured by gravitational interference. These inconsistencies made him uniquely suited for the mission, not because he was gifted, but because he was already partially attuned to the distortions. Murph's storyline took on a more ominous tone as well. She wasn't decoding messages from a benevolent, higher-dimensional being. She was analyzing gravitational patterns, believed to be warnings from an unknown intelligence attempting to stabilize the collapsing fabric of spacetime. Her work suggested that humanity wasn't being guided toward survival, but away from something catastrophic. The ending of the early script was starkly different. Instead of escaping the Tesseract, Cooper witnessed multiple versions of Earth, some scorched, some abandoned, others erased entirely. The implication was that the mission had interfered with countless timelines, unwittingly destroying many of them. The studio rejected this vision as too bleak, too abstract, and emotionally unresolved. The final film became a tribute to love and endurance, but the original script whispered a harsher truth, that the cosmos is indifferent, and humanity is fragile in ways we barely comprehend. 2. 12 Monkeys. 12 Monkeys is already famous for its mind-bending narrative, but the film's earliest drafts pushed the idea of fractured time and unstable identity much further. Instead of relying on a physical time travel mechanism, the original script suggested that travel was achieved by forcibly dividing consciousness and projecting fragments of it across different moments in history. Subjects rarely returned whole, and those who did often carried overlapping memories from contradictory timelines. James Cole wasn't a prisoner selected for a mission. He was a failed test subject whose fractured consciousness had begun bleeding into multiple temporal states. His visions weren't premonitions, they were glimpses of alternate versions of himself scattered across collapsed timelines. Studio notes described these scenes as too destabilizing for wide audiences. Dr. Rayleigh's role was even more unsettling in the early drafts. Instead of a psychiatrist drawn into Cole's delusions, she was an investigator studying the neurological consequences of the consciousness-splitting program. Her recognition of Cole stemmed from archived sketches created by earlier subjects, many of whom claimed they had encountered the same man in eras they could not possibly have visited. The viral apocalypse storyline was originally something far stranger. Instead of a deliberate act by extremists, the outbreak was framed as the unintended biological fallout from the experiments themselves. The future society guiding Cole wasn't humanity's hope, it was a fragmented remnant of the research team trying to contain the chaos they had unleashed. The finished film left audiences pondering causality, but the original script offered a darker interpretation. That the collapse of time wasn't caused by humanity's mistakes, it was a symptom of consciousness pushed beyond its natural limits. 3. Sunshine. The film audiences ultimately saw hints at psychological unraveling, but the earliest drafts of Sunshine envisioned something far more profound and far more terrifying. The mission wasn't originally about reigniting the dying sun. It was a desperate attempt to understand a set of inexplicable signals embedded within solar radiation. Early documents describe these signals not as random fluctuations, but as structured patterns, almost like encoded messages woven into the fabric of sunlight itself. Kappa was initially written as a scientist haunted by the disappearance of a mentor who claimed to have decoded fragments of the solar pattern. His recruitment wasn't based solely on brilliance, it was because he'd already begun experiencing sensory anomalies linked to the sun's emissions. Flashes of irrelevant memories, fleeting visions of impossible landscapes, and auditory distortions that grew stronger the closer he studied the data. The deterioration of the crew wasn't framed as stress or isolation. In early drafts, each crew member manifested unique symptoms aligned with their psychological vulnerabilities. Some heard whispers in their own voices. Others found themselves recalling events that never happened. The ship's corridors were described as subtly shifting in geometry with each solar burst, as if reacting to the crew's unraveling perception. Pinbacker wasn't a deranged survivor in this version. He was portrayed as the first human whose consciousness had been completely subsumed by the solar patterns, no longer a man, but a vessel echoing the structured radiation itself. His presence aboard the Icarus II wasn't physical intrusion, it was a form of psychic contamination manifested through the crew's exposure. The final film embraced awe and tension, but the initial script suggested something far more disturbing, that humanity was never meant to look directly at the sun, not because of its heat, but because of what might be hidden inside its light. 4. The Abyss. The awe-inspiring mystery of the Abyss belies an early script rooted in deep technological and existential fear. In its first incarnation, the underwater entities weren't benevolent watchers, but an ancient, distributed intelligence woven through the trench, a biomechanical organism stretching across the seafloor. Their glowing crafts weren't ships, they were sensory extensions of a much larger whole, testing intruders. Bud Brigman's background was dramatically different. Instead of a hardened foreman, he was originally portrayed as a former Navy technician who had participated in a classified salvage mission years earlier, one that stumbled upon an unexplainable formation resembling smooth architecture embedded in the ocean bed. Since that encounter, he'd been plagued by intrusive geometric visions and rhythmic auditory pulses that no doctor could identify. Lindsay, too, bore a different role. She wasn't just a designer of deep-sea platforms. She was initially written as part of a covert analysis team, studying anomalous sonar signatures that defied natural explanation. One removed sequence described the crew discovering a pulsating corridor deep within the trench, its walls shifting organically as if alive. Studio notes flagged this as too disturbing and too suggestive. The original ending wasn't an uplifting warning to humanity about war, it was a stark revelation. Humanity had been trespassing in an occupied domain. The intelligence below wasn't preparing to judge us, it was deliberately limiting its exposure, watching closely for signs of further intrusion. The theatrical version reframed the entities as compassionate, but the first draft told a very different story, one in which the ocean wasn't a frontier, but a boundary set by something that had been there long before us. 5. Avatar. Though the released version of Avatar presents Pandora as a living cathedral of natural wonder, its original script envisioned the planet as a haunting archive of abandoned human experiments. Early drafts suggested that the first scientific teams on Pandora conducted unauthorized biological and neurological trials, leaving behind hybrid organisms, unstable gene-spliced prototypes, and a psychic residue embedded within the world's interconnected biosphere. Jake Sully wasn't supposed to be an idealistic newcomer. He was written as a former operative marked by neurological damage from classified neural link experiments. His paralysis wasn't the result of a battlefield incident, but a catastrophic failure during one of these early trials. His participation in the Avatar program wasn't redemption, it was reactivation. Neytiri's mistrust had very different roots. Instead of skepticism toward outsiders, she carried inherited trauma from earlier contact with hybrid subjects created by broken experiments, beings that looked Na'vi but behaved unpredictably due to corrupted neural patterns. These abandoned plotlines were dismissed after executives raised concerns about parallels to real-world debates surrounding genetic ethics. Pandora's ecosystem was depicted with even more unease. The planet's neural network wasn't spiritual. It was portrayed as a vast, involuntary recorder of memory echoes from anyone who interfaced with it, storing impressions of suffering, fear, and violence from both Na'vi and human experiments. Avatars weren't graceful vessels, they were unstable constructs, requiring continuous recalibration to prevent cognitive crosstalk. The version that reached theaters celebrated harmony and unity. The version that came first warned of scientific overreach and a world that remembered every mistake humanity tried to bury. 6. Inception. Long before Inception became defined by its elegant dream heist architecture, its earliest drafts explored a far more chaotic and psychologically corrosive concept. Dream infiltration was not a refined skill or an underground profession. It was first written as a classified interrogation technique developed within high-security research facilities. The subconscious wasn't visualized as stylish urban mazes. Instead, early scripts described it as a volatile mental territory, shaped by trauma, regret, and unresolved memory loops. Navigating it resembled stepping through an unstable neurological minefield. Cobb's character wasn't a smooth, guilt-ridden extractor. He was originally conceived as someone irreparably scarred by prolonged exposure to malfunctioning dream cycles. His perception of reality was unreliable. Hallways shifted subtly in his presence. Familiar voices echoed from empty rooms, and fragmented memories bled into his waking life. These weren't cinematic flourishes, they were documented after-effects of neural entanglement. Limbo was radically different as well. Instead of an infinite wasteland of collapsing architecture, it was written as a repository of half-formed constructs left behind by subjects who had mentally fractured. These residual imprints behaved like mimics, reproducing the faces and movements of loved ones, replaying past traumas, and attempting to trap intruders in recursive loops. Ariadne's purpose in the early draft wasn't to build dreamscapes, but to recognize and dismantle these psychological snares. The script's conclusion offered no ambiguous spinning top. Cobb encountered a contradiction in his own memories, so severe that it rendered his sense of identity unreliable. The implication was clear. He had never fully resurfaced from a deep interrogation cycle. Studio feedback labeled this ending too nihilistic and too opaque, leading to a considerable rewrite. The final film kept the complexity but shed the existential terror, leaving behind a blueprint where dream exploration resembled psychological warfare more than a heist. 7. Minority Report. Before Minority Report became a polished thriller exploring free will and predictive policing, its earlier drafts veered sharply into psychological horror and state-engineered cognition. The pre-crime program wasn't based on clairvoyant prodigies, it was fueled by civilians subjected to extreme neurological conditioning. These individuals didn't see the future. They hallucinated simulated events generated by implanted memories, trauma loops, and sensory deprivation protocols. John Anderton wasn't a grieving father in this draft. He was written as a mentally broken escapee from early-stage pre-crime experiments, someone whose mind had been fractured into overlapping temporal perceptions. His visions weren't system errors. They were remnants of conditioning sessions that had never fully faded, spilling into his waking reality. Dr. Rayleigh wasn't originally a therapist figure. Her early role was that of a researcher specializing in cognitive contamination among subjects exposed to long-term sensory manipulation. She recognized Anderton because his face appeared repeatedly in archived sketches and testimony from other victims, all of whom described him in events that hadn't happened yet. The conspiracy that framed Anderton was not political corruption, it was the system itself attempting to neutralize him because his fractured perception threatened to expose the truth. The initial ending revealed Anderton waking up submerged in a sensory isolation tank, unsure whether any part of his experience had occurred outside the engineered reality designed to contain him. The finished film brought clarity and structure, but the original vision dealt with something far more unsettling. A future where the state didn't just predict your actions, it rewrote your consciousness until you became the prophecy. 8. The Fifth Element. The flamboyant, colorful universe of The Fifth Element conceals an early draft steeped in cosmic dread, ancient warfare, and existential terror. The great evil wasn't originally a sentient planet or abstract malevolence. It was conceived as a pre-cosmic entity, a self-replicating intelligence able to dismantle molecular structures and overwrite living systems. Humanity wasn't dealing with a philosophical threat, but the remnants of a primordial catastrophe recorded in fragmented alien archives. Corbin Dallas was never meant to be a jaded cab driver. He was first imagined as the traumatized survivor of a black-budget reconnaissance mission that stumbled upon a mining colony wiped clean by an unidentified force. His recurring visions weren't dreams, they were echoes left behind by exposure to an anomalous energy field that destabilized the memories of the entire mission crew. Lilu's origins were even more unsettling. Instead of a reconstructed, perfect being, she was a vessel assembled from extracted genetic fragments belonging to a species that once battled the primordial entity. Early drafts hinted she might not share human intentions at all. She was a living failsafe designed for interstellar containment, not companionship. The climax, too, was far more dangerous. The ritual involving the stones required Dallas to perform neural synchronization with Lilu, risking permanent dissolution of his personality. Studio executives quickly flagged the sequence for feeling too experimental and too reminiscent of unverified neural fusion research. The final movie embraced spectacle and humor, but the abandoned drafts whispered a harsher truth. Humanity was never the hero of this story. It was merely a temporary obstacle in a conflict billions of years old. 9. Back to the Future. Before Back to the Future became the energetic, comedic cornerstone of time travel cinema, its earliest script painted a world defined by secrecy, hazardous technology, and unintended temporal contamination. The time machine wasn't a polished DeLorean at first, it was a crude, unstable reactor tower mounted on a military-grade transport frame. Doc Brown wasn't the eccentric neighborhood scientist, but a former propulsion engineer who vanished after smuggling out classified components linked to experimental space-time research. The early drafts implied that his disappearance wasn't an accident. He had seen something in the data that frightened him enough to flee. Marty wasn't meant to be Doc's enthusiastic accomplice. He was originally a teenager, mapping unexplained electromagnetic distortions around Brown's property, distortions created by previous time displacement attempts that left the environment subtly warped. One removed scene described Marty walking through a field where plant life coiled into perfect geometric spirals, mirroring patterns appearing in restricted geological surveys. The future Marty traveled to was not a playful, neon-colored world. It resembled a rigid corporate state shaped by decades of monopolization of stolen temporal energy technologies. Scenes showed sterile streets, synchronized citizens, and a historical record that had been quietly rewritten. Studio advisors expressed concern that these depictions too closely reflected classified predictions about economic authoritarianism. When Marty returned to his timeline, the differences were not charming or uplifting. People remembered events he never lived. Street clocks drifted. Familiar objects felt slightly misplaced, as though space itself hadn't reassembled perfectly. The early script emphasized temporal instability rather than comedic adventure. The final film became a family classic, but beneath it lies an abandoned draft about dangerous inventions, contaminated timelines, and the consequences of tampering with forces no human fully understood. 10. The Terminator. Before The Terminator solidified its status as a streamlined battle between man and machine, its first drafts told a story far more complex and rooted in human error. Skynet wasn't a self-aware AI uprising, it was a catastrophic fusion of multiple classified systems forced into integration by military policy. The collapse that doomed humanity wasn't rebellion, but a cascade failure triggered by incompatible protocols feeding into one another, until the network could no longer distinguish simulation from authorization. The Terminator wasn't originally a sleek cyborg infiltrator either. Early drafts described it as a grotesquely reconstructed organism built from remnants of human test subjects once used in cybernetic augmentation trials. Behavioral anomalies weren't bugs, they were remnants of the consciousnesses that lingered within the creature's patchwork neural matrix. Sarah Connor's role also held far more sinister weight. Instead of being chosen arbitrarily, she was part of a discontinued genetic program intended to cultivate adaptive traits for future warfare. Her child's significance was rooted in controlled lineage rather than random destiny. Kyle Reese's explanation of the future painted a society shaped by bioengineering failures rather than pure technological revolt. The early ending was even more hopeless. Sarah discovered evidence, implying that the war had started long before Skynet's emergence. Seeded by human experiments that fragmented reality between overlapping timelines of cause and consequence, executives softened these elements to focus on clean action and a clear villain. But the earlier script revealed a far more disturbing truth. Humanity wasn't merely fighting machines, it was fighting the aftermath of its own dangerous ambition. 11. Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The uplifting mystique of Close Encounters masks an original script that was considerably more unsettling, portraying contact with extraterrestrial intelligence as a phenomenon that destabilizes the human mind. Before its tone shifted toward wonder, the story began as a psychological thriller rooted in shared hallucinations, electromagnetic disturbances, and unexplained disappearances. Roy Neary wasn't originally drawn to the phenomenon by awe. He was haunted by neurological reactions, periodic memory disruptions, involuntary muscle spasms, and sensory distortions that blurred the boundary between perception and imagination. Early drafts portrayed these symptoms as widespread among witnesses of the aerial events. Investigators analyzed soil samples carrying irradiated patterns matching classified satellite readings, implying that the encounters weren't harmless displays but deliberate probes. The original script included a chilling disappearance sequence, an entire small town vanishing at once, leaving homes intact as though time had paused mid-action. The government task force assigned to the case wasn't rooted in curiosity, they were engaging an established protocol meant for potentially hostile contact events. Even the climactic encounter ended differently. Instead of hopeful exchange, the humans chosen to board the craft did so without any promise of return. One removed line suggested the extraterrestrials were collecting neurological data rather than inviting cooperation. These ideas were ultimately softened, replaced with a narrative built around awe and unity. But the early script explored a far darker possibility, that humanity might not be prepared for what real contact would feel like or survive what it might demand. 12. Alien. In the earliest iterations of Alien, the screenplay leaned heavily into the notion that the terrifying creature aboard the Nostromo wasn't an ancient extraterrestrial, but the byproduct of a failed scientific endeavor. Early drafts described the derelict not as an alien relic, but as a controlled transport vessel equipped to carry genetically engineered organisms created through off-world experimentation. Human involvement in the creature's existence was not implied, it was central. Ripley's character was also conceived with a far different history. Instead of a disciplined officer thrust unexpectedly into crisis, she was first written as someone with prior knowledge of classified contamination cases, incidents involving biological tests gone silent. Her suspicion of company orders wasn't intuitive. It stemmed from having witnessed suppressed outbreaks during earlier missions. Ash, too, underwent significant changes. Rather than a synthetic infiltrator, he was initially a human scientist whose mind had deteriorated from exposure to prior iterations of the organism, causing hallucinations and an unstable obsession with its evolutionary potential. The xenomorph itself was described in disturbingly specific terms. The early script emphasized that the creature had been engineered to exploit human anatomy with surgical precision, its parasitic life cycle intentionally designed rather than naturally occurring. This detail drew immediate concern from studio leadership, who feared the implications of portraying humanity as the architect of the horror. By the final version, these themes were muted or erased entirely, leaving audiences with a more ambiguous terror. But buried within the first drafts is a far more chilling concept: the idea that humanity had unwittingly created and lost control of its own perfect predator. 13. E.T., the extraterrestrial. Although E.T. became a global symbol of warmth and innocence, its early script drafts were shaped by fear, tension, and disturbing encounters that lean toward horror. This embryonic version, derived from the abandoned Project Night Skies, portrayed a group of extraterrestrials visiting Earth not as explorers, but as fragmented members of a failing species performing desperate biological analyses. The gentle character, who became E.T., was originally only one of several entities, each with drastically different motives. Early sequences depicted bizarre electrical behavior, livestock anomalies, and psychological disturbances among children sensitive to the alien's presence. Elliot, in these pages, wasn't a lonely dreamer. He was a traumatized child whose emotional vulnerability made him susceptible to telepathic intrusions from the visiting being. Draft notes described him receiving images he couldn't explain, diagrams of organs, unfamiliar star maps, and snapshots of cold, clinical procedures performed by the other aliens. Studio concerns escalated when consultants noted that certain scenes mirrored historical accounts from unexplained aerial encounter reports. Spielberg ultimately redirected the tone toward emotional connection, stripping away the more ominous undertones. Elements of the earlier script still lingered. E.T.'s uncanny healing abilities, his energy manipulation, and his psychic bond with Elliot all came from the darker concept of a biologically sophisticated species whose intentions were unclear. The finished film became a story about friendship, but the original version hinted at something more ambiguous and far more frightening. 14. The Matrix. Long before The Matrix evolved into the iconic cyberpunk rebellion we know, its first script drafts explored a more metaphysical and eerie premise, one where humanity was trapped not inside a digital world created by machines, but inside a malfunctioning consciousness preservation experiment once run by government intelligence group. Neo wasn't imagined as a hacker disrupting the system. He was a data specialist who stumbled onto corrupted files containing fragments of a discontinued project designed to store human minds after physical death. In this early vision, the real world wasn't a mechanical apocalypse. It was a sterile underground complex where scientists struggled to maintain what little remained of human cognition. Morpheus wasn't a revolutionary. He was a defector who once monitored the psychological unraveling of subjects trapped inside the simulation. Trinity, too, was reimagined not as a seasoned operative, but as a survivor of repeated neural link sessions that left her with fractured memories from multiple simulated existences. Agent Smith was originally something far stranger. He wasn't a program policing the system. He was the corrupted digital echo of an intelligence operative whose consciousness had been preserved long after his death. His hostility stemmed from the instability of that imprint. The system itself was decaying, and so was he. Test audiences reportedly reacted with discomfort to sequences in which characters glimpsed conflicting memories from alternate iterations of themselves. Studio executives pushed back, fearing the movie would feel too abstract and too closely tied to real discussions around neural interface research. The streamlined cyberpunk reality that audiences eventually saw was only a shadow of these earlier ideas, a version with sharper action and cleaner logic, but far less philosophical dread. 15. Blade Runner. Before the world knew Blade Runner as a neon-drenched noir about identity and synthetic life, its earliest script resembled something far more unsettling, a bleak chronicle of uncontrolled bioengineering and the aftermath of abandoned human experiments. In its raw form, future Los Angeles wasn't a polluted metropolis. It was portrayed as a zone under long-term containment, shaped by decades of illicit research programs that blurred the line between artificial organisms and altered human subjects. The replicants weren't corporate products, they were survivors of Black Ops, genetic modifications that had spiraled out of control. Deckard, in these original pages, wasn't an exhausted detective, but a former field auditor who once investigated unauthorized biological trials. His familiarity with replicants came from first-hand encounters with test subjects whose mental states deteriorated after exposure to prototype gene processes. Roy Batty's origins were even darker. Instead of being a combat model nearing the end of his life, he carried reconstructed memories derived from a missing soldier whose fate was never resolved. The implication was chilling. The real man might have been erased, replaced, or harvested. The discarded ending intensified this moral unease. Instead of escaping with Rachel, Deckard discovered that the distinctions between human and replicant were deliberately obscured, and that many so-called synthetics were genetically edited humans manipulated without consent. Studio executives rejected this idea after internal advisors warned that the parallels to real-world biomedical ethics were uncomfortably direct. What survived into the theatrical release retained pieces of this darkness, but the earlier drafts revealed a story that cut even deeper, one where the true horror wasn't artificial life, but what humanity was willing to do in the name of progress. Bonus: The Thing. The version of The Thing that reached theaters is already a masterpiece of paranoia, but the earliest draft of the script described a far more insidious threat, one that made the alien far more terrifying than a simple shape-shifting predator. In those pages, the organism didn't merely imitate physical forms. It reconstructed personalities, emotional profiles, and layers of memory extracted from every living being it absorbed. Identity wasn't just stolen, it was replicated with alarming accuracy. One discarded sequence detailed a recovered voice log from a previous Antarctic team. The voice belonged to a researcher whose frozen body had been discovered long before the recording was made. Yet the recording referenced conversations that occurred after the team's disappearance. Studio executives immediately flagged the scene as too destabilizing, afraid it suggested the creature existed across time rather than biology. The early script also introduced the notion of psychological infiltration. Crew members found themselves recalling memories that weren't theirs, brief flashes of alien landscapes, unknown faces, or traumatic events they could not explain. These were not hallucinations, they were residue, leftover impressions from entities the creature had consumed on other worlds. McReady's function in this early draft was to track these cognitive anomalies, trying to determine who was still human and who had already been overwritten from the inside out. The original ending was even more haunting. Instead of a tense standoff in the snow, one survivor experienced overlapping memory sequences, events that contradicted physical reality, implying the creature had already embedded itself in the fabric of their consciousness. The final line, later removed, warned, "Thought can be copied long before flesh." The finished film focused on physical imitation. The earliest script revealed a far more terrifying idea, that the creature's ultimate target was never the human body, it was the human mind. What we opened tonight was only a fragment of a much deeper archive pages, rewritten in secret, concepts buried under studio mandates, and entire narratives reshaped long before audiences ever saw a single frame. These early drafts aren't just alternate versions of famous films, they're traces of what creators once dared to imagine before caution, politics, or fear intervened. If you want to keep uncovering the hidden histories of sci-fi cinema, those lost drafts, forbidden ideas, and story studios preferred to lock away, stay with Vaulted Futures. Subscribe, unlock the next sealed folder, and return as we continue to expose the versions Hollywood never meant for anyone to see. Because in this world, the script you know is rarely the script that began it all.